Hi everyone, William here with the Grand Duke Dmitri video series on YouTube. It's the 7th of July 2025 and we're dealing with material today from the 3rd of June 1939. I got a big spike in views this week, so I'm really happy that you're interested in this material, the 1939 material in particular. It was unexpected. I don't know how much people know about or are interested in Prince Vladimir, so-called Grand Duke Vladimir. So I finally thought, well, I guess I should take a look at least at his Wikipedia page, which I did, and I was a little surprised to see that what was said about this period is that he rebuffed the Nazis' offer of the Tsarship of Ukraine. And he did not. He did not. That was, he was sort of forced to, in the end, by Dmitri and Grunwald and presumably other people. But yeah, it is a bit sort of, not covering up is too strong a word, but sort of brushing over what the reality of that situation is. And you know, I mean, I keep saying it, he was 22. I'm not trying to be, I'm not trying to ruin his historical reputation. But since we have this information, shouldn't it be included in the historical record? I think so. So our last diary entry was 1915 January. Dmitri talked about this sense that he would wake up but not really wake up, and he was in this kind of stuporous state in the mornings. Still trying to figure all that out. He was trying to figure it out. I'm trying to figure it out. And then later in the day, the main thing that he talked about was reading this book about Grand Duke Sergei. He calls it Vоспоминания, which means memoirs. But he doesn't really give the impression that it was memoirs. He's not really saying, so that's what Uncle Sergei thought about what happened on my birthday in 1904. So anyway, plus Dmitri was finding it kind of boring. All right, so now our recap of 1939. Well, we just have this picture of Vladimir as a problem child. You know, he's a bit, he's in the hands of some sinister people, mainly Biskupski. Even from a distance, you know, this man has undue influence on him, if we believe Grunwald. And so that's a problem. Okay, our cast today, we have Sablin. I always want to call him Mikhail, but he wasn't, and I always forget his name. The man who was the kind of the center of the emigre community in London, because he continued to operate this. It was no longer the Russian embassy, of course, but he was a former diplomat, and he was helping people out, amongst them Dmitri, with various travel documents and things like that. So he was still kind of fulfilling that role. And we have the Infanta Beatrice, Vladimir's aunt, his mother's sister. And we have Viscount Astor, Waldorf Astor. How would you like to be named Waldorf? Anyway, he is making an appearance, so to speak. So here we go. The sojourn of the pretender to the throne at an English factory would not have been such a bad thing if it had been organized in another way. It's still better than serving in a guards regiment in Potsdam. But the complete isolation of the young Grand Duke, his installation among the petit bourgeois inhabitants of a provincial town, the absence of any intellectual influence are not well suited to prepare a future emperor. The old ladies of the emigration way may well be moved by this factory work, but the imitation of Peter the Great is hardly convincing. Your great ancestor worked in a shipyard, but he never thought of becoming a carpenter. Oddly enough, the Grand Duke's address has been kept secret. Monsieur Sablin doesn't know it. The only person who's in on the mystery, aside from the police and the Infanta Beatrice, is Viscount Astor, the acknowledged head of the Germanophile party in London. But his complete and brutal lecture, him being Vladimir here, but his complete and brutal lecture to the young Russians and his hostility towards Grand Duke Dmitri are very disquieting symptoms. I met the Grand Duke during my last trip to London. I had tea with him, and I have to admit that he did not at all make a bad impression on me. You're being a little hard on him, madam. He's definitely no genius, but he seems quite alert and aware of many things. But what direction is he being pointed toward? And what new complications might he create for us in the future? So the Grand Duke here, lest there be any mistake at all, the one that is being met for tea and assessed is Vladimir and not Dmitri. All right, here we go. Let's start with this. Well, I can't give you the details. I knew that at one point in his life, Vladimir had worked in a factory in England, so good for him, and I can't tell you the details. There wasn't anything about it in his Wikipedia entry, and I didn't go any further than that, shameful though that is. And so let's talk about Peter the Great in that context. Well, of course, Grunwald was a historian. I don't know that he was necessarily a specialist in Peter the Great. My own PhD supervisor, Professor Lindsay Hughes, was a specialist in Peter the Great. So that was of great benefit to me. But anyway, I've probably forgotten 80% of what I learned from her anyway. What can we say about Peter the Great? Yes, Peter the Great was a hands-on kind of guy from the time he was a little kid. And he wanted to learn everything. He wanted to, he insisted on rising up in the military ranks one step at a time, starting out as a drummer boy with these little regiments that he assembled himself, that became the Guards regiments. And he was sincere in that. He wanted to learn any skill that attracted his interest. And one of the things, as you no doubt know, that he was interested in was naval warfare, seafaring, anything to do with boats. So he went incognito. I think he was called Pyotr Mikhailovich. He went incognito to the Netherlands and did take a position as apprentice shipbuilder. And I'm sure he knew carpentry, so I'm not sure quite what Grunwald is talking about when he says that he didn't intend to become a carpenter. Well, of course, he was already emperor. He didn't intend to give up his, not emperor at that time. He was Tsar. He would become emperor in 1724. But he didn't intend to retire from being Tsar and become a carpenter, although he did marry a beer maid, kind of. But, anyway, he was always learning new things. One of the things he learned, unfortunately for the people around him, was dentistry. And so he would forcefully do dental work on people at court. But yeah, he spent this time in a shipyard. He did it genuinely. He learned. And that is all to his credit, just as it was to Vladimir's credit that he went and worked in a factory for maybe a year. I don't know how long. Hopefully long enough to really learn something about what he was doing. But Grunwald considers it problematic, not because of any snobbery. Well, yes, because of snobbery. Not because, I guess, it isn't a good learning experience and it looks good. These old Russian ladies in the emigration are very touched by this and they admire that he's doing this. But the fact that he's stuck away in the provinces among petit bourgeois and not getting any intellectual education. Okay, without being a snob myself, I agree with him on that. Things are happening in the world, and Vladimir needs to be able to have a solid sense of them. And the inference here being that one of the reasons that he fell into this whole thing with the Nazis was because he didn't have such a foundation, or he had the wrong foundation given to him by non-intellectual people like Biskupski, who were quite sinister. So that's fair enough. It's not a good preparation for a future emperor. Seriously, did Grunwald actually think that there was any chance in the universe of Vladimir ever becoming an actual emperor? I mean, Tsar is one thing, but you would have to have more than the monarchy revived in Russia. You'd have to have the whole Russian Empire revived. So, but maybe, yeah, I mean, come on, that wasn't going to happen. He doesn't need preparation to be a future emperor, but he does need preparation to be a creditable Tsar in, potential Tsar, protector of the throne, whatever you want to call him. Okay, so the imitation of Peter the Great, was it that? That's an interesting question. Was Vladimir doing this, or was it suggested to him that he should do this on the basis of Peter the Great's example? None of the other Grand Dukes had ever felt that need, but maybe in 1939, yeah, I don't know. So Sablin doesn't know his address, even though Sablin is the sort of nerve center, the brain of the emigres, at least in England, at least in the UK. Who does know about it? Well, Beatrice, the notorious baby B, and that makes perfect sense because Vladimir's parents had both died, and she was his aunt. So presumably she was sort of in loco parentis. I mean, he was a grown man, but he needed a parental figure in his life. So that was good of her to do that. And then Viscount Astor, Waldorf Astor, the second Viscount Astor. What the heck? How was he connected to Vladimir so that he even knew this address? I don't know. I had to look him up. I knew nothing about him. I just saw that he was the leader of this so-called Cliveden set, and they were indeed pro-German. They were not pro-Nazi per se. We're not talking about, for instance, Sir Oswald Mosley. Now that would have been a disaster. Sir Oswald Mosley was a fascist. He was pro-Nazi. His wife was very pro-Nazi. My friend Philip, who just passed away last April, Mosley's son, was his best friend, Michael Mosley. But Michael Mosley was raised, because of all the problems with his parents, his stepmother, his father. Michael Mosley was raised by Irene Curzon. Anyway, I digress. So anyway, Grunwald thinks that Viscount Astor is having an outsized influence on young Vladimir in a pro-German direction, though not a pro-Nazi direction. As I said, Astor he was an anti-Semite. His wife, Nancy Astor, was an anti-Semite. But once the war got going, they were on board, and they were not Mosleys. They were not part of that. So now we find out that Maria has had some harsh words for Vladimir. I only have this I have two letters from this correspondence. The other one is later. The other one is he's reporting to Maria on what he's been able to find out about Dmitri's stay at Chateau, and he's talking about his own flight from Paris when the Germans took over. Very interesting, and we'll get to that one. But in the course of this correspondence, clearly Maria has said has a very harsh assessment of young Vladimir, and Grunwald, even though he said in the previous paragraph that Vladimir is ruining them all, he's discrediting the whole entire imperial family and destroying their path back to Russia. Even so, he's telling Marie, look, he's a nice young man. I had tea with him. He was nice. And yeah, he's not the sharpest tool in the shed. He's not all that bright. He's no genius, but if he had the right guidance, right, he would be fine. That's the impression I get from what Grunwald says. Maria and Dmitri came from the smart branch of the Romanov family, the very smart branch of the Romanov family, and alas, Vladimir did not. The Vladimirovichi were not the smart branch of the family. Look at Boris and Andrei, Kirill himself. Yeah, Dmitri and Maria came from the Konstantinovich through their mother and through their maternal grandmother. They came from the Konstantinovich branch of the family, and in my opinion, Grand Duke Konstantin Nikolaevich was a genius. He was a force of nature, almost up there with Peter the Great, and he was a very, very, very intelligent man. And his son, Konstantin Konstantinovich, another very intelligent man, very sensitive, artist, very intelligent. And Dmitri and Maria came from that branch of the family. So they were, in my mind at least, sort of on a higher intellectual plane, even though they weren't necessarily what I would consider well-educated. Dmitri did try, he had his tutor from the London School of Economics, who in his own memoirs said, this is a smart guy. This is a guy who picks things up quickly. And he studied Roman law, and he studied other things. And so, it probably was a bit difficult for them to see the not-so-bright branch of the family being the one that is sort of in charge of things, in a sense. I think Nikolai Nikolaevich was also a very smart man, and I think his father, even though his father had real problems, was as well. So unfortunate that the Vladimirovichi were not. But I'm talking too much about that. I know that. Okay, complications for us. If this continues, what direction is he being pointed toward? Well, I think we know what direction he's being pointed toward. And what new complications might he create for us in the future? Yeah, good question. Good question. Let me see. Did I take in? I didn't take any notes on what I read in just my cursory read-through of the Wikipedia article, except that it seems to me that he was moved around, and yes, he was very briefly in an internment camp in Compiègne, as were a lot of other Russian emigres in France, and as no doubt in my mind whatsoever, Dmitri would have been, along with Kazanbek, along with Vladimir Krasinski. They all passed through Compiègne. But he was still, somewhat, I don't know, the Nazis still helped him out, and they brought him to Germany, and they put him for his own security, supposedly, in a castle there, and yeah. So he lived in his sister's castle, I think, in Bavaria, which was, of course, the real hotbed of Nazism, not Berlin. He lived there until 1945, and they were apparently really scared that he was going to be captured by the Soviets. The Soviets didn't give a damn about him, or about Dmitri for that matter. Anyway, what do we have next? Well, we have in our next 1939 diary entry Dmitri in his transformation into a patriot of Europe instead of a Russian nationalist. And well, we know that Grunwald has his problems with Dmitri, and he's kind of a little bit disgusted that Dmitri, that all of the political interest in him has gone to his head, and that he's almost not interested in so much in emigre politics anymore because his head has been turned by various people, including Winston Churchill. A lot to say about that. And also, sort of paradoxically, the fact that Dmitri is under some danger from Maisky because various people want to introduce him to Maisky. So Maisky was the Soviet envoy to England, to the UK, who was being feted by all the British aristocracy, and was this very charming figure. And yeah, so Grunwald is a little worried that Dmitri might get swept up in this as well. As for our next 1915 diary entry, well, we just have our friend there in Usovo feeling rotten, feeling bored, and waiting for Balashova to write him a letter, for God's sake. What's taking her so long? So come back for that. I'll see you next time. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.